Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm David Butler.
I'm Emily Freeman.
This is Don't Miss This. We're super excited that everybody is here. Welcome if you're new. Welcome if you're old. Welcome if you're a medium. We're happy to have all of you. Listen, we've gotten a lot of people who say about where to get the papers. We can't see it. We want to zoom in on the papers. And you can get them right now as a download. They come every week in our newsletter. And the newsletter is that download, also tips on if you wanted to teach little kids, or if you have teenagers, or if you're just a couple together or a group of older people without kids or teenagers.
Which we love, all the empty nesters who study together.
Yes. And, our favorite one is the email we got from our soldier friends in Afghanistan.
That's right.
So we want to give a special hello to you who are studying over there, and thank you on behalf of a grateful nation for everything that you are doing. And so that's really neat. So we've got those tips in there for like one lesson idea for each of those groups. And then also there's this study guide, which you can fill in as you watch the video or as you study on your own. And it's awesome. So that comes in that newsletter.
And you sign up for the newsletter at emilybellfreeman.com. Something about a newsletter.
/ don't miss this.
Oh.
Yeah. The link is in her Instagram profile, Emily Bell Freeman, and my Instagram profile, Mr. Dave Butler. That's easy to find there. So that's where you can get that. This is the happy news for those of you who are like me, who hate printing this every single week, even though I make it every single week. For next year, yes, Don't Miss This continues through the Book of Mormon year. We're committing.
Who's happy about that? We've had like 10,000 people ask if we
So, yes, we are doing the Book of Mormon year. And we have these study guide sheets that we are putting into a study journal with extra pages for notes, spots for revelation. We'll show you sneak peeks beforehand. The pre-orders coming up for them. That's already printed. The whole year's already printed up into a bound journal. And we're super excited about that. So, anyways, in the meantime, newsletter, then that other thing is coming. So, there was that, and I think that's all we wanted to say.
I think you did it.
Okay.
That is right.
So, today and next week are two spots. The book of Hebrews is divided into two different groups. So, this is a letter that a lot of people actually, there's no indication as to who wrote it. So last week, remember, we ended on Philemon, which is the smallest of Paul's letters we know for sure. And now we're starting this one that comes before Peter, John, James, because nobody...
Should you sing that?
Yeah. I forgot how it went, but it just was coming to me in a vision. But Hebrews is just stuck in there because people don't really know when it was written. When, to who, to from. Although, this is what we do know, is that it's written to people of faith. So people who already believe in Jesus and are trying to follow him in their life. And in the it's at the end, chapter 13, that he uses this phrase, the writer, he says this is a word of exhortation, or a translation of that we like a little bit better, is this is a message of encouragement.
And the reason why that would have been important is a lot of Bible scholars feel like this was probably written before 70 AD. And 70 AD is when there's just everything starts falling apart. So these are the saints in the last days of that time, the saints who are holding on when they're just trying to get through. And we love that it is a last days message, that it's a call to faith, that it is a message of encouragement for those who are just trying to do their best, to live their best in really trying times.
Right. As the world starts to polarize more and more during their time period, it becomes harder and harder to be a Christian, and it's reflective of our spot. So here is your call to faith. Here is your word of encouragement for our day, written 2,000 years ago. So this is fun. Okay, what we want to start with is right at the very beginning of the book of Hebrews. Paul, I don't know if it's Paul.
He's going to say Paul over and over again. So he thinks it's written by Paul. Just go with that.
Okay, so some guy who I got emotional because I thought it was Paul. Some person who wrote this is trying to explain throughout the entire book. Remember, this is people who are steeped in the Old Testament culture. And so he's going to teach them like everything that happened in the Old Testament. The high priests, the angels, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the the temple, everything pointed toward Jesus. And that's what he wants to show, but he wants to say, and Jesus is more than all of those. And he says right at the very beginning, God, who at sundry times in diverse manners, in all different ways, and all the time in the past, is what that means, spake unto our fathers by the prophets. He says, in these days, these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So he says the gospel message came through all of the prophets in the past in so many different ways. And he said most recently, the gospel message has come through, personified, in fact, by his Son. And then he starts listing, starts talking about almost like, here's why, why that's even better than a message through the prophets. And he starts mentioning he is king of the universe. Mm-hmm. He's creator of the world. He has sat down on the right hand of majesty on high and in power. He's all of these things. He's like, he's not just a messenger. He is God himself who's come with the gospel message for the whole world. And that's who he is. And the way that he speaks is what we really want to focus on right here. So kind of over right here on this side this is who he is, that he's actual the Son of God, the King of the world, the Messiah, the resurrected one, the powerful one. But he is also human, is what the writer wants to say. He is God and human at the same time. So we've got these verses right here that we want to kind of look at to talk about that show that description of him too.
And what I love about this as we go through and look at it is what we're being taught in Hebrews is what we're also taught in the Book of Mormon. The word we use is condescension. It's the fact that Jesus was a God who actually came down to where we are. And we learn why that is so important at the end of Hebrews. And it's just a beautiful message. The Book of Mormon does the same thing. It tells us why we see the reason for that condescension in Alma 7:11 through 13. But the book of Hebrews does that same thing. So this is going to go through, and it's just going to talk about on each of these things that he made himself lower than the angels.
Oh, I forgot I wrote them all right here. I was
he
like, how do you know
agreed to
those?
be the captain of our salvation.
And I was thinking about captain of our salvation right before you said it was, I love that in Titanic.
I didn't watch Titanic because I have a rule, everyone. I can't watch sad movies.
Yeah, if I give her movie recommendation, she was like, does it end sad? I've lied before. But, not the movie, but in the real story. It might be in the movie. I don't know. But in the real story, there's the lifeboats that only save so many people. And it's the captain who chooses to go down with the ship. He's like, I'm not going to leave the ship, and I'm not going to leave, because a good captain does that. So I love that description of him. He's like, he's the captain of our salvation, meaning he is on the boat with us. And if the ship goes down, he's going down with us. But happily, it's salvation, not the captain of death, And he's like, I'm going to steer this ship, Mm-hmm. I'm going to steer it to salvation. Okay, keep listening.
And he's going to sanctify us, right? He's going to elevate us. And then in verse 17, it talks about, wherefore in all things it behooveth him to be made like unto his brethren. So he's made like us. He agreed to come down and be one of us, to experience what mortality was like, so that he could be a merciful and a faithful high priest. I love that his mortal experience gave him the ability to be merciful and faithful.
Right.
That was required for him to be able to give a fullness of that.
It's interesting that this whole list right here is him of exalted king, but he's a different type of king. Mm-hmm. He doesn't rule from the castle, right? He comes down and he's there among the people. Matthew wanted to give one of the names of Jesus, you remember, Emmanuel, which means God with us. That he's actually here in our stories with us and everything. So it's just a really, really
and
powerful
the last verse
dichotomy.
Is going to maybe that was a really big word. The last verse is going to tell us why. The last verse also tells us he also agreed to come down and suffered being tempted. So really, he experienced everything we were going to experience. And the answer why is at the very end of verse 18. It says, so that he is able to succor them that are tempted and tried and proven. The whole reason he did all of these things was so that he could succor us. And we love, both of us, when we saw the word succor, immediately went to different translations for that word that we love. The Hebrew, the Greek, and the Latin translation of the word succor really helps you gain a good understanding of what that word means. So the Hebrew would be to surround or protect. You love that. To surround or protect. The Greek is to aid and to help. And the Latin is his most favorite.
Yeah, the Latin one is to run to. Again, that idea of just like I'm not gonna throw help from, from the top of the parade route. I'm gonna come down to where the problem is. I'm not gonna mosey to it.
Yes.
I'm gonna run to where you are, and I'm going to protect you. I'm gonna aid. So he's able to do that because he is God and has all power, but he also understands perfectly what it means to be human and what it means to be mortal.
That. And it would be interesting if this is a concept that either you struggle with or you wish you understood better. Go through Scripture, because Scripture is going to testify over and over and over again that this is the character of Christ. In the Old Testament, one of my favorite verses there that testifies of this is Deuteronomy 2:7. But we'll see it over and over. You see it in the life of Moses several times. You see it in the life of Joshua. But then when we get to the New Testament, it is just clear. You want to look at stories of, just ask yourself this question when you think about your favorite stories in the New Testament. When you think of the woman at the well, where was Jesus? And he was at the well. When you think of the man laying on the stairs at the pool of Bethesda, where was Jesus? On the stairs. When you think about Peter walking on water, this is one of my favorite ones. Jesus wasn't in the boat giving instructions, and he wasn't on the land calling encouragement. He was in the water. And we talked about at Easter, another favorite of mine, that for the criminal on the cross, Christ met him on the cross. Like when it talks about him succoring us where we are, if that's literal, he really is going to come into the places where we are. That's the character of Christ. That's what he does.
Yeah, awesome. We also love this spot in chapter 2, verse 4, where he says, God also bears witness of his character and of his ability to succor through a couple of things. He says, through signs, wonders, miracles, and gifts. And we thought it would be a really neat thing to talk, or by yourself, just kind of think back. What are some of the signs, wonders, miracles, and gifts that he's given to me or shown to me that show me what his character is actually like?
And that he's there with you. When have you experienced him with you through wonders or signs or miracles or gifts of the Holy Spirit? When have those moments been? Sometimes it's just so good for us to sit for a minute and think, where have I seen Christ in my life recently? What I've learned from teaching seminary is if that is not something that you've practiced on a regular basis, you have to go back clear till the summer to think, have I seen Christ in my life recently? But once you start a pattern of looking, you will realize that you can pinpoint moments within even the last 24 hours that you just know the Lord is working in your life.
And what's going to be interesting, this will come into play more next week, but Paul's actually going to say, in order to live with trust, you had to have already experienced or tasted God's goodness. Like you don't just like believe like out of the blue, out of the whim. It's based off of past experiences with him. So that's what's so valuable about looking for him in your life, because it encourages your hope and it encourages your faith. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of today, but the next time at the end of the book of Hebrews. Remember, we have to split it because you can't do the whole book in church or in 1 week, but it was all one speech, actually.
Yeah,
a lot of people think like it was meant to
sermon.
be like read out loud as an entire sermon. So it would take you 45 minutes if you wanted to read the whole thing out loud sometime.
What if you just did that for gospel doctrine? And now we will have Hebrews.
The sermon. But read it from the Message or no one will know what you're saying. Okay.
We love chapter 2, verse 1. One of the things we love about Hebrews, and we're going to see it a couple times, is he carefully points out two opposites on purpose. He'll do that over and over again. This is one of the first times we see that happen, and we love what he's showing here. He says, therefore we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. So you have two choices there. To give earnest heed or to let them slip. And when you think about the time they were living in and that last days time for them of just when the church was going to go into apostasy and everything was going to change and it was not going to be the way it was when Christ was there, that probably was the battle of their time. There was believers who knew to give earnest heed, and there were believers who were letting things slip. And the outcome of their spiritual safety depended on those decisions. And when we were talking about this lesson, both of us just immediately thought, well, what is one way we can give more earnest heed? Like if you were to look at your life right now, where is one place you need to give more earnest heed? Don't choose 20 things. That feels overwhelming, but maybe just choose one. There's just a little box right here. Just choose one place that you maybe could give more earnest heed.
And we love that it's in conjunction with what we've already been talking about. He's not saying give more earnest heed to God or else. What he's done is he's taught in conjunction, like give more earnest heed to the one who's shown you signs and wonders and miracles. Give more earnest heed to the one who created the world and sits as King of Kings. Give more earnest heed to the one who went lower than the angels so that he could suffer temptation and mortality with you. Like that exhortation from whoever this is comes in conjunction with who you're giving more earnest heed to. It's not a stranger. There was this line, where is that? The sanctified one. Look at this one right here. He says, for both he that sanctifieth, that's Jesus, and they who are sanctified, that would be us, are all of one. Meaning like through that process of being sanctified, we become more one with him. He says, for which caused he not ashamed to call them brethren.
I love that part.
Yeah, it's like when you've been through those holy experiences with him, you know that he's not ashamed to be with you. And then now the call is, will you be ashamed to be with me? You know?
Yeah.
So it's together, it's in conjunction, it happens.
As he sets us up for this more earnest heed, he actually goes through in this message of encouragement and says, let me give you some ideas. Like if you can't think of something you want to do, let me just give you some ideas of what it might look like to give more earnest heed. And we love, these are just those great one-liners that sometimes we see through this second half of the New Testament. Starting in chapter 3, he says, harden not your hearts. That's one. Take heed. Exhort one another. We love this one in verse 14 so much. This makes me think of Elder Holland every time I read it. I don't know why, but it's that hold fast to the things that you know. And he says, hold the beginning of your confidence. I just love that. He's like, go back to that moment when you knew. That moment when you, those first moments of conversion when you just had that fire. Hold on to that at the beginning. I think that is such good advice. Hold the beginning of your confidence.
And then he says, and with that, stay steadfast unto the end, right? Because if it was right a year ago, it's still right today. If it was right 5 years ago, it's still right today. And that's why, again, coming back to that whole idea of like, come back to those past memories and experiences when you've tasted and experienced that.
And just holding on to those evidences. We're going to talk about that more, but there is just something about holding on to the evidence of your faith. And
this one that where it says in verse 13, is that not on here? Oh, here it is. Okay. I was like, wait, we forgot my favorite one. I love that he says exhort, and remember exhort also means encourage one another daily, while it is called today. I love that concept of a community of faith, that you have to encourage each other. We have to encourage each other every single day. That is how fragile faith can be. That's how fragile hope is, that it requires a daily. No one's saying like do this or else. It's like this is just it just as, remember Harold B. Lee, it's harder to hold than a moonbeam.
Yeah.
You know, I remember visiting somebody in our neighborhood who was just going through a struggling time, and I came back from it, and I said to Jenny, there are some problems that are just not going to be fixed, at least in the near future. And I said, I think our job is just to carry some people throughout all of mortality, because that's not going to be solved. The problem might not go away. And so what do? That person who's got the problem has just got to surround themselves with people who will encourage and exhort them their whole life.
I last night was walking over to a neighbor's house and saw another neighbor coming out of that house. And who loves when you live in a neighborhood where neighbors just come and go? I wish that happened every night in our neighborhood. That's totally my personality. But one of our kids is really struggling right now. And as I was walking into the house, this other neighbor stopped me and they were like, listen, we just want you to know we know what's going on and we're aware of the situation. And will you call that child and tell them we believe in them and we're praying for them? And it just lifted my heart because sometimes people either forget or they're like, we probably shouldn't talk about that, like we should probably just let them be handling that. But it was so nice for someone to be like, we know what's happening. We're totally aware of the situation. And we just want you to know we love you. We're praying for you. There's just strength that comes from being encouraged.
Yeah. Every day. Every day.
Does it make you want to think to yourself, in the past 24 hours, have I encouraged anyone? Are we really living intentionally to be that voice of encouragement?
And nobody ever doesn't want encouragement, I might not need you to come in and solve anything, and you probably can't, but nobody ever dismisses encouragement. Sometimes we think, well, maybe I'll wait until things kind of settle down or whatever. It's like, that's not when I need you. When I need you is while things are riled up. Yeah. That's when I need you to encourage me, not when they've settled down.
Yeah. So we love that one. The last two.
I keep looking at this.
I know, that's so confusing. Believe. And then the last one is also, this probably
your
is
best one. This is your best one.
The whole first half of Hebrews. Please bless that everybody's gospel doctrine teacher teaches this verse. And if they don't, just raise your hand and be like, I'd like to add one verse to the lesson. It's the best verse. 4:16. It says this, let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And I love that thought about come boldly. Don't be afraid. That we look at the Savior and we look at him saying, I'm going to come where you are. I'm going to be where you are. I'm in this with you. And just come boldly into that relationship.
You're allowed, right?
Yeah.
The verse before it is great. It says, because we don't have a high priest that can't be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. We don't have one that doesn't know what it's like. We don't have a king who grew up with a silver spoon, right? He was in all points tempted like we are, and yet without sin, meaning he has the power to overcome it, and he also understands it at the same time. So you can, there is this idea of if he knew what I was really like,
or what I was going through.
Yeah. It's just but and you feel timid sometimes. It's I don't feel permitted. And this is the invitation. No, you are not only allowed to approach the throne of grace. Please come boldly to the throne of grace, exactly as you are. You don't have to get washed up before you come. He is the one who will do the washing. Yeah. So come boldly to that throne.
Yeah, it's so good.
This is such a good verse.
Love that one so much.
And
then we love this one too. 4:2. It says this, for unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit the people who are no longer believers.
No, the past people. It's the past. He's remember back in the wilderness with Moses, they also were preached the gospel, but they didn't enter into the rest.
It didn't profit them. So I think, you really can look at it as
either group.
For some reason, the gospel makes a change for some people, and it doesn't make a change for some people. He's acknowledging that there are some who hear the gospel, there are some who hear the word, and it actually, it doesn't affect them. It doesn't change them because it wasn't mixed with faith in them that heard it. And I love this verse so much because he's teaching us the word by itself, the gospel by itself in a person, the conversion power has to be mixed with faith. We've got to give something back to it. The word comes in, and faith is going to prompt us to act. It's going to prompt us to do something. It's going to prompt us to become something different. And it's the mixing of faith and gospel, or the word. It's the mixing is when the miracles start to happen.
Yeah, and I love also reading that because I love that word faith as the trust as a synonym for faith. Or it's like you can't just hear the gospel, but the gospel is meant to lead you to trust in God, right? And if it's not leading you to that, if the word's not leading you to Him, the word can't be the end game.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be leading you to relationship and trust with Him, and that's when the power comes in.
Yep. And as you go through this, this thought of the rest that is going to come, that leads right into 3 that says, "For we which have believed do enter into that rest." And for some reason, for the last 2 weeks, I have had so many conversations with friends and just women that I know that have talked about there is a great power in belief. There is a great power in faith. You think about, I don't know if anyone ever makes caramel corn, but my mom has this really unbelievable recipe that I love so much, and I should put it in there.
I don't
because
even know
it's
what
fall.
that is.
Caramel corn?
Yeah.
What?
Popcorn?
With caramel on it, and it's sticky, and you pick it up, and there's a big
caramel
clump.
popcorn.
Caramel corn.
Oh, well, I'm thinking like corn,
Well,
with caramel on it. I was like, ooh.
It's caramel popcorn.
Okay.
Okay, everyone,
Sorry.
go back.
Sorry.
So you make your white popcorn, and then you home make the caramel. And the best part of my mom's recipe, and we would all gather around when my mom made it when we were little, because there is a moment when she pours in baking soda, and do you know what happens?
Bubbles?
Yes, like it's going to come out of the pot. You watch it almost come out of the pot, because there is just something about adding that into the mixture that all of a sudden makes it come alive. That's what I think of when I read this book.
It's such a fun image. I'm so happy about that.
You just need that mixture.
Everybody has to do this for your activity. We'll put it in the newsletter.
We'll put it in the newsletter,
the
and
recipe,
you'll be
because,
so happy.
and then you just teach the lessons like, and this is faith.
Yeah, don't make it beforehand. Make it while everybody's watching.
That's really cool.
And also, a word of warning: don't use a small pot, because it will come out. So, like my mom's pot is like, I need all my hands right now. My mom's pot's like this big, like this. Okay, and you're making it in the bottom, so you think you don't know why you're using such a big pot, but then when you put that in, it all comes out.
That's awesome.
This is so fun.
Super fun. This is going to come up again, so let's just bring it up right now. Where he talks about entering into his rest. Remember in Matthew 11, Jesus describes rest as coming into a yoke with him. So rest doesn't necessarily mean the end of trouble. One day it will. One day it means that. But rest means like in the yoke with him. So to be in companionship with.
And another good definition for rest would be, and we don't use this language very much anymore, so it's not as familiar with this, but I have a vase that I love. It's my grandma's. It's cut glass. It seriously is my favorite vase that I own. And I usually only use it once a year when my peonies come into bloom, because they are so pretty in that vase. And I can remember walking one year from my kitchen into my bedroom, and I wanted to put that vase somewhere where everyone could see it. And I had this shelf, and I was like, oh, if I put it up there, you'll see the flowers and the vase really, really well. But I don't trust the shelf. It leans out from the wall, so I can't rest it on the shelf because I don't trust the shelf. And there's something about that word rest when you think about trust, that you can rest on someone or something when you trust that it's stable enough to allow you to rest there. And I love thinking of that when he says, if you just believe, then you can rest, right? Because he's going to succor you. He's going to help you. He's going to allow his atonement and his grace to work in your life. You can rest on that. You can trust that is going to happen for you.
Yeah. That's going to come up again at the end, right here, when we get into this hope spot. And then again with the faith next time. Remember, all one sermon. Okay, let's talk about this thing right here.
Yeah, this is a
in
great
chapter
verse
5. Again, it's just he's talking about Jesus, who he says, even though he was a son, the Son of God, he learned obedience, or I like in the Message it says trusting obedience, or
The
in
Greek, it's attentive hearkening and submission. Do
Yeah.
you love that? Obedience is attentive listening and then submitting to what you've heard.
Yeah.
I kind of never want to say the word obedience again.
Yeah, because it gives like a...
Task list.
Yeah.
A checklist.
Right.
Chores.
Okay, let's say those words again. Trust, attentive listening, and submission is what obedience means. And he learned those things. He learned how to trust. He learned how to attentively listen and how to submit by the things which he suffered. And I love it starts with even though he were a son, because sometimes you might say, wait, if I really am a son of God, if I really am a daughter of God, would he be allowing me to have this type of circumstance? You know, the soldier said it to Jesus when he was on the cross. If you really were the Son of God, would he have let you be crucified? And Satan says it to him in the wilderness. If you really were the Son of God, would he have left you hungry? Would he have left you without any followers? Would he have left you without a kingdom or a house to call your own, if that's really who you were? And it's interesting. It's because, no, it really is through the suffering that he learned
how to listen attentively and submit and to let go of the things that were going to hold him back from relationship with the Father.
Yeah, and you think sometimes not. I had this experience once where I was in a hospital room over in Israel. Actually, it was, hopefully that doesn't happen again and on our trip. And in there, and I yeah, it's true. I remember thinking about, I was just in a really, really low, painful place, and everything, like, it was just bad. And I remember thinking about this whole concept of Jesus knows how you feel, and he succors you. And I was reading that in the scriptures, and I actually just threw them just off the bed. And I was like, that doesn't even matter. Like, who cares if he understands how I feel? Because he's not doing anything about it. So if he really understood me, then he would fix the problem, is the conclusion. I was like, so who cares that he understands, right? And it was interesting how as the days passed, the lessons that I learned through my suffering, the lessons of, I became more humble and listened. And I remember coming back from there, my grandma asking me, was like, would you go again if you... No, I actually said to her, even though all of that happened, I don't want to trade everything that I learned from the experience. Because I hear God's voice with a little bit more tenderness now. I submit to him in a new kind of way. I trust him differently, and it all came through a suffering experience that happened. And she was really mad because she was like, well, we all were so worried about you. Like, why? She said, why would you put me through that again?
Oh,
that's what she said to me.
Awesome.
Gee, love you. But that's that whole concept,
yeah.
right? Where it's just like, and I also learned that there is something about, he's like, no, he didn't take those away. But just knowing that he knew and sensing his presence, he was just present through most of it.
Yeah.
And why didn't he take away the suffering? Well, because that's where he learned those lessons.
And think about it.
Suffering.
Think if that is true in your own life. If you look back at some of your hardest moments, did you learn how to listen more attentively? For me, that is so true, because I was so desperate for succoring, for anything, that I made myself submit to the point that I could listen more attentively, because I was desperate for help. That's where I was. And I think there's just sometimes it's like fasting on Sunday, right? There's something about submission for our body that allows us to hear better, to listen more attentively. And I think that's what he's trying to teach. It's not just on Fast Sunday. It actually can happen with our trials. It can happen over the course of our life. And it doesn't just happen for us. It happened also for him. So he understands the process.
Right, what that is like. So when we ask the same question, does God really value me? Am I really his son? Am I really his daughter if this is happening? It's like, well, look at the story of Jesus, and absolutely, absolutely are. The temptation, though, is that when you said, I'm desperate, and it's interesting, and when doctors can't do anything, when friends can't do anything, when family can't do anything, you do feel like alone, right? And it's like, what am I going to learn in those alone moments? Man, but Jesus has been there. right? He's been to that place. And so there is something to learn. And if you're in the middle of it, hold out, because there is something to be learned through the experience.
And tender lessons you will never want to let go of.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing you said to your grandma, those are words I've said, and I'll never forget sitting on the porch of a dear friend who had just lost a baby, an 18-month-old baby, and asking her that question, would you give up the memory of that child so you didn't have to go through all the things you went through over the past 18 months? And her answer was just the same. No, I would do it all again. It's so funny how we would choose to do the worst thing that ever happened in our life again, simply because of what we learned about Jesus Christ. And that's what she said. I'll never forget that mother saying, because of what I learned about Jesus Christ, I would never give up that experience, as hard as it was and as painful as it was. I would never give it up.
And isn't it interesting that it's when it's over and we're looking back that we have that feeling? Because when you're in the middle of it, you don't feel that way. Think of the disciples on the boat during the storm. In the middle, storms by nature make it impossible to see, even God.
Yeah.
You can't even see God in a storm. And it's not until, remember, Matthew writes the storm story after the resurrection. He's recollecting that story, and he's like, oh yeah, he was actually there. He really was there. And looking back, it becomes this. But in the middle, it's so hard. You just have to kind of. This is why we encourage each other daily, right? It's because like when someone's in it, they need someone else to encourage
remind
them.
And that's leads us to our last thing, which we love, because we get hope from the people who have already lived it before. And the writer of Hebrews is going to teach us that. He's going to tell us, if you're in a place that isn't hopeful, you got to look back to someone who's lived it before and rely on them. And I love one of the things that he does in Hebrews 6. He starts talking about Abraham in verse 13. When God made the promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And I love that he takes us back to Abraham, because think about Abraham's promise. Abraham's promise really was the promise of saying, no, there's no way that can happen. Let me list you all the reasons why that isn't going to happen. I have no children. Do you know how old my wife is? And that wife has one son. She doesn't have 10,000, right? That if you look at it logically and you're like, I don't know if that is right or if that's going to work out. And I love that that's the one he takes us to. He's like, let me take you to the one that makes the least amount of sense. The promise that just, because then you look at your promise and it's probably easier for God than Abraham's promise was. And I love when we look back at Romans, because this is why you think maybe Paul was the one who wrote the letter, because he's going to go back to this language.
He did the same thing.
In Romans, where he was trying to give hope again. And he says this, listen, let me take you back to Abraham, who against hope believed in hope. And being not weak in faith, he staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, being fully persuaded that what God had promised, he was able also to perform. And here in Hebrews, he says that same thing. He says, when God said, surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And then I love this part. And so, after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise.
That's verse 15, back in Hebrews 6.
Yes, and I love the thought of that. Like, you might be in a place of patiently enduring. That might be where you are. You might be in the waiting place. Just in that moment where God is working in the waiting, and you maybe don't see the working taking place, but you're just patiently enduring until the promise is manifest. And then he says to you, that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us. And so then you start thinking, well, what is the hope? What is the hope set before us? And he says in verse 19, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast. And then in verse 20, he just says these two words that are so powerful at the end of this, even Jesus. That is the hope. And as you look at this paper, the one who is greater than all, right? He can overcome anything. He's bigger than anything you're facing, but he came down to where you are and experienced it, and you've got all these words of encouragement to be able to get through, and that patiently enduring. And what are you going to put in front of you the whole time to remind you? Even Jesus. Just that promise of someone who's bigger than this and who has experienced this. Even Jesus. And the succoring that will attend you through that process.
In every experience, both of your past, in every experience of scriptural past, of every experience of family members past, will show you that same exact story. It's like Abraham's promises really did come true. Like God followed through. He didn't lie. He made them happen. And in the story of Jesus, they happened also. He really did rise from the dead. And so for these Hebrew saints and for us, like we look back on that and we're like, wow, he really does do the impossible things. I can lay hold on that with both of my hands onto that hope and endure patiently. I can rest on even Jesus.
Yeah, so good. Okay, so there's Hebrews week 1. Next week we'll have Hebrews
week 2.
Week 2.
It's good.
See you then.
See ya.